Hello. In this video we're going to look at how a river starts off its life high in the mountains before working its way down through the landscape and eventually entering the sea. So, as I mentioned, all rivers will start their life in the high ground that is found in mountains or very hilly areas. And these areas receive a lot of rain, and so it's a good place to collect water and for the rivers to begin their journey. The start of the river is called the source. And the source can either be a lake or a bog of marshy ground that you would squelch on if you walked over it. From there, our river will flow down steep hills and around the mountainsides, cutting down into the mountains themselves. So you can see here, it begins to form these valleys. Here's my hillsides. The river is cutting its way between those hillsides. And that valley we call, because of its shape, a V-shaped valley. Geography is lovely in the fact that most of its names are very descriptive to help us out. So this is a V-shaped valley, and it's formed by the river cutting down and formed with steep sides. As we carry on our journey, still quite high up in the river, we might get another smaller river joining our main river. We call this smaller river a tributary. And where a tributary and the main river join, this is called a confluence, where two rivers join. Tributary, smaller river. So that's what's happening up in the higher areas where our river starts its life. And in a second, I'm going to ask you to look at your definition sheet and try and put on some of these key words based on what we've just understood. But before we do that, let's have a couple of questions. What do we call the place where a river starts? That's right, it's the source. And where or what might the source be? Good, a lake or a bog, well done. Now up in those mountains, the river is cutting down into the rock. What does it create when it cuts down into the rock? Very nice, these V-shaped valleys with their steep sides. Later on, a smaller river might join the main river. What's our name for a smaller river that joins the main river? Yep, you got it, a tributary. And finally, when two rivers join, what's that place called? Super stuff, a confluence. Now we're going to pause the video and you are going to look at your definition sheet and try and put in these definitions here that I'm marking with a red asterisk, or these key words, to match their definitions. Off you go. Right, we're back on course. So, As we flow downstream, our river starts to bend a little more. I'm going to have to move my page up here. Until it starts forming really large loops, which we call meanders. The other thing to notice here is that as we move downstream, our river starts to get a little bit wider because there's more water flowing into it as all those tributaries join. So we can add another tributary here. There we go, adding more water to my river channel so that it becomes wider and deeper. So let's have a look at some of these features that we've got shown on this bottom section of my diagram. The first thing to point out is, what do we actually call this bit that the river is in? So the name for that is the river channel. River channel. And that is the landform that contains the water of the river. And you'll find that river channel between two banks. Lovely. The last feature that I want to point out here is that by the time we get down towards, this is the coastline by the way, and this is the sea. By the time we get down towards the sea, the land around the river is really flat. It used to be high, mountainous, but now we're by the sea. The land is lovely and flat, where you might get cows grazing or people building cities, because building on flat land is so much easier. We call this area of flat land that we find either side of our river, we call this the floodplain. Floodplain. We've got the floodplain here as well. And that is an area of flat land either side of the river. Now, just putting the sea in a different colour, where the water or the river enters the sea, we call this the mouth. And that is where the river enters the sea. Now a mouth can have two different kinds of mouth, and we'll look at these in more detail in future lessons, but one is called a delta and one is called an estuary. By the way, it can also be a lake. It doesn't have to enter the sea. So this is our lower part of the river, and once again I'm going to ask you to put these key words into your the correct space on your definitions bank. Got quite a few this time. So before we do that, a quick few questions to get you all on board. What is the name of the landform that contains the river's water? Very good, it's the river channel. And what do we find either side of the river channel that helps to hold the water in the channel? Indeed, it is the river banks. Well done. And then, how would you describe the land around the end of the river near the sea? Would you describe it as being flat, hilly, or steep land? Yes, indeed, it is very flat usually. And what do we call the flat land either side of our river? Bingo! It is the floodplain. Well done. And finally, where the river enters the sea, what do we call that? The mouth. Well done. And if we want to get really posh and technical, what two different types of river mouth do we have? Well done, everybody. A delta and an estuary. Excellent. Now, I'd like you to complete those, putting those key terms into your definitions box, and we should have, by my reckoning, 2 spaces left, which I shall be back in just a second to explain to you. Off you go. Right, I've just zoomed out a little bit because I want to show you something that's very important when we come to talk about rivers, and that is the fact that we can draw an imaginary line all the way around where this river is operating. There we go. And inside that imaginary line, we call it the drainage basin. And what that means is that any rain falling anywhere within that line will end up going into this river and flowing out the mouth here. But any rain falling just the other side, even if it's just 1 meter the other side, that will go into a different drainage basin and flow out to the sea by a different river. And the reason, and we call this imaginary line the watershed. And the reason that happens is because the watershed is always a line of hills. If you imagine that we've got the peaks of those hills all the way along the watershed, and now you can see that any water or rain that falls here is going to flow down the slopes here and eventually go into our river there. But if you just move a tiny way over the crest of the hill so that your raindrop is landing here, well, that is going to flow in that direction and join another river and another drainage basin. So the drainage basin is the area that drains into a river, and the watershed is the imaginary line that marks the edge of a drainage basin. Good. With that information, I reckon you'll be able to complete your definition sheet and move on. Well done.